For more stories like these, go to www.social-tv.co.za, subscribe to us on YouTube and follow us on our social mediums.
You're listening to our social newscast with me, Sam Marshall, brought to you by www.social-tv.co.za. We speak to Mike Hanley from New Leaf Technologies about the role of e-learning and how it's a game changer in the learning space. Mike, why do you think e-learning is rosier in South Africa at the moment?
Well, I believe it's rosier for a number of reasons. And one of the main reasons for me is accessibility. So you've got a lot of individuals that are stuck at home, unable to get to work, unable to travel, and accessibility to get online and to upskill yourself is partly why it is rosier. I think it could well be even rosier with things like data costs and devices being a little bit more affordable, and that would give the accessibility a wider range of participants and a bigger audience. But I believe fundamentally, a lot of people have some more time on their hands, and they should be using that time in the most productive fashion to upskill themselves, to give them a clearer path forward with their careers, and use the time productively with all the resources available to them.
Your company has seen a massive increase, and we're going to be talking about 270% increase in product and services. What is it about COVID? Is it the idea that we've been able to reset? You earlier talked a little bit that we've got more time.
So I think part and parcel, if you think about COVID, to me, it's almost like Mother Nature's method of change management. We've always seen a bit of an increase towards the adoption of digitization across the board, particularly in e-learning. The term e-learning was actually coined in 1998. And since that point, the adoption rate has always been fairly consistent and always been on an upward trend. And I think, a lot of companies that maybe were sitting on the fence or didn't even consider doing any training online, suddenly it's the only method they have available. And that is the main cause of this huge adoption that we've been seeing in recent months. Because, as I said earlier, you've got a lot of people that don't have access to a classroom or a training facility. So the only method they have left available is to get trained virtually. So you need virtual instructors to do so. You need platforms to enable it. And e-learning is the best possible route to success at the moment in that regard.
We've also seen the evolution, haven't we, Mike, of e-learning platforms. Gone back in the day when it was incredibly basic to completely immersive, completely interactive experience.
Yeah, you're right. So I think maybe e-learning might have a bit of a bad rep, because I think people think about the login and read or the next type of approach to e-learning. But the medium has changed drastically over the years. It's a lot more dynamic. It's hugely engaging and interactive. And it's no longer a next experience. It's a pure learning experience that is fun. And if you think about edutainment, meaning education and entertainment being coupled together, it really allows learners to engage with the learning topics at hand, and it elevates their knowledge retention in it because it's something that they enjoy. So I think, the medium in the last 10, 20 years has changed drastically, and we're only seeing more and more technologies enabling that. So we're looking at virtual reality, augmented reality, searchable videos, interactive videos, really fun stuff. And it's really showing that, things like knowledge retention, user uptake are on the rise because of these facts.
Has e-learning over the last 20 years moved the needle on issues around credibility? I know that around the world you can get an MBA online in a year. If you speak to the purists here, they'll tell you that's not a real MBA. And depending on who you speak to, have you guys been able to move the dial on credibility?
I think that's a really interesting question. And I feel quite strongly, I'm still a millennial, so when I think of brick and mortar establishments, I think of really long-term commitments. So if you're looking at doing a degree, you're looking at a really long-term commitment. Whereas I think the space is going is more micro-learning and more of a continuous learning pattern, where it's no longer an event, it's a continuous pattern that lasts your whole life. And, I would love if YouTube had a degree of sorts. I could have an MBA in cat videos, for instance, just as a bit of humor. But to be honest, there's so much valuable information out there. And I think credibility, if you think of a typical university where you get a stamp and a certificate at the end of the day for passing those courses and for being committed to them, I think that's fair enough. But I also feel like if Elon Musk, for instance, had to curate content, books, information, and put it into a learning path that makes didactical sense, and he himself put a stamp of approval at the end of it, I don't know if it would weigh up against some of those traditional academia establishments. And for me, as an employer, I really look at not only what degree you might have, but what experience you have, and how have you taken the time, how have you been productive around the peripheral of your degree and your work life. What tutorials have you done? How many short courses have you done? What are you doing to upskill yourself? And I really think that in itself is credible.
We've seen COVID shift mindsets, the way we operate, the way we work, the way we interact. Why can't COVID reset the way we think about the role of e-learning in this space at the moment? And I love the idea. I've got to be honest. I love the idea that if you've clocked enough hours on YouTube in a particular industry, that there could be some kind of certificate of recognition. Why is that conversation not being advanced at the moment, when in every other sector you're seeing that effect of COVID and remote learning and the role of technology?
So I think partly it's to do with legislation, compliance. So typically, sectors that have good adoption of things like online learning are industries that are very compliance heavy. So your sectors like banks and mining companies, there's a lot of governance around compliance. So the adoption of e-learning in these sectors is huge. And there is something called RPR, which is recognized prior learning. And if you think about NQF levels and all the sort of standards around education and academia, it's always a level up. It's always a point exercise. I just don't think it's adopted broadly enough to encompass things like your YouTube videos or your TED Talks that you've watched, or even just passing information from one to the other. If you think about education traditionally, it's always a transfer of knowledge from one individual to another. And how that's captured or how that's delivered at the moment in the digital space, it's just becoming really dispersed and really readily available. So it is difficult to track and monitor an individual's learning path. But I think that conversation is changing, and I think there is recognition, and I think you are seeing the ecosystem evolve, partly due to the accessibility of knowledge and information.
As somebody who plays in this space, Mike, if I had to put you in the hot seat, when do you see these changes taking place? 5-10 years ago, if you talked about digital advertising taking the lion's share of traditional advertising, you would have been laughed out of the room. And that's exactly what's happening now. In this period, if you talked about people moving away from traditional TV sets onto their cell phones for entertainment, content, news, you name it, you would have probably been laughed out of the room, and that's happening now. Why can't e-learning do exactly the same and completely disrupt the education space, the learning space?
Mm-hmm. Well, if you think about it, classroom-based training hasn't really changed in thousands of years. So I think it is time for people to realize maybe a bit of a kick up the butt is a good thing. And as I mentioned earlier, something like COVID-19 is a form of forced change management. It's Mother Nature's way of saying you need to change. You need to go paperless and digital because, one, it protects the environment. Two, it can be more accessible. So, if you think about a teacher that's teaching in a classroom, they might rock up to class and have they might be having a terrible day. They might not have access to the best resources. So learning online really allows for higher consistency And it also provides access to key experts regardless of your geographical location. So I don't think there's a better way to equip learners by granting them exposure to the best resources available. So I do think there is a gradual shift, and it's not going to be immediate. And I don't think you'll ever lose that face-to-face value of a teacher in a classroom or a trainer or an instructor. But I do think the digital aid of it is so complementary that the adoption is going to be driven, and things like COVID have just sort of enforced it to make it happen a little bit faster. Do I think that the brick and mortar establishments will ever be outrun or overweighed by digital? I don't think so. But I do think that the parallel or the complements of digital are going to be adopted far more so across the board, from your primary school education right the way through to being trained in a corporate.
South Africa's digital population is standing at 36.5 million active internet users, right? With almost 35 million active mobile internet users. That's about 62%, 59% respectively of the country's population. Are you happy as a learning software services company with the kind of penetration within government and the private sector? Or is there massive room for growth still?
I think there's always room for growth. I think if you look at statistics, something like 80% of content that's viewed online is video, and video is very expensive on the data side. So I think, the barriers to entry are data costs are high. So, we've helped certain companies and certain training providers that offer things like reverse URL, which means that the end user doesn't get billed for the consumption of their content. So I think there needs to be a greater push from government and private sector in terms of accessibility, making the data costs a bit cheaper, more affordable. Of course, not everyone has a smartphone or a device that allows them to engage with learning materials. So I do believe that it's a lot cheaper to get a tablet in the hands of the many as opposed to a school in the hands of the few. So I think it's a bit more of a cost-effective method. And again, because you're not bound by a geographical location, there can be a wider adoption, and that audience would gain better exposure to the right resources, so they get a better quality of education at the end of the day.
Final question. You're an organization that operates across Africa into the Middle East, but you're also aware of the global trends. Are we on par with the rest of the world in terms of the adoption of learning software and services?
In some ways, yes. So certain sectors, certainly, I'd say we are leaders in some respect, in some capacity in certain sectors. I think, globally across the board, adoption rates really pick up dependent on industry. So I do see some leaders in our environment in Africa, especially around compliance-based industries, where adoption is huge. And some of the trends that we're seeing are, of course, some of the exciting technologies like your augmented realities, virtual reality, as well as more mobile-based learning. And typically people don't design fit-for-purpose mobile content in a bite-sized way. So I think there's still a long way to go for the market to mature in Africa, certainly, as opposed to where, if you look in Europe and maybe in the States, the adoption rates there are far higher. So there's still a long way to go, but I think we're in the right foot. And I do think that, if you took today being the baseline, probably the worst it will ever be, and it's a good foundation to build from.
Mike, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's been great to chat to you.
Thank you, Mike. That's Mike Hanley, CEO of New Leaf Technologies, talking to us about e-learning platforms and the potential that they have to change the learning environment within not only South Africa, but also beyond the shores of the African continent.